title said, I'm from New York City. I'm very excited to be talking about this topic. When I was researching this, I found a couple of articles from the Judge program about stress and conflict management, and I also looked into a lot of stuff from other professions, such as the medical profession, police, teachers who have to deal with students. I found that there was a lot of information out there, but not much as it applied to interacting with players, especially when we're in the role of a judge. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be very excited to hear from all of you, have you ask any questions you may have. When you think of a Magic tournament, what is the first thing that comes to mind?
Fun.
Fun? Okay, I like fun. You want fun.
Customer service.
Customer service.
Keeping it fair.
Keeping things fair. In the front. Magic the Gathering. Great. Well, I think when we think of a Magic tournament, kind of what we want is something like this. We have polite, sporting players watched over by a judge. But sometimes what we get is this. Just like players are upset, want to flip the table, are very frustrated. And this is because Magic is actually a game about conflict. This is in the lore. You have two powerful planeswalkers duking it out over the battlefield. Why? Doesn't really matter. But we're casting creatures, casting spells. Every game of Magic has a winner and a loser. Magic is inherently a game about conflict, and I'm going to actually mention a word that Matteo used in the first presentation. Magic is not a zero-sum game. If I win, that means somebody else has to lose. Somebody else is not going to get what they want. There's always a conflict in Magic, and there's always going to be stakes, especially at a Magic Fest, at an MCQ, at a Grand Prix, at the kind of events that we're all going to be judging now and in the future. So with that in mind, conflict is permeating us, and that's what informs the things we're going to talk about today. So first of all, I'm going to try and justify why these skills are important, not just in judging, but beyond that. I'm then going to talk about strategies for resolving conflict, as one half of the presentation would expect. And I'm also going to talk about strategies for de-escalation. I think these are two related, but actually distinct topics that I'll be discussing. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are officials, we are pseudo-referees at these events. We can and sometimes will be giving out penalties for players' behavior. How do you do that in a way that avoids further escalation, and in a way that's fair to ourselves, fair to the players, and upholds the documents that we have? So those are the things we're going to be discussing, but also while I'm thinking of that, does anyone have any particular goals or things that they wanted to get out of this presentation? When you saw it was on the agenda, what were you thinking? We're just like, oh well, it's the leadership conference. I'm gonna be here no matter what. What did you think? Like, I actually really want to learn about this today. Yeah.
Conflict resolution, de-escalation is usually we have an angry player.
Yeah.
However, it's not always the angry player. Sometimes it's the crying child or the depressed person, things like that. That still falls into the realm of de-escalation and conflict resolution. I would like to hear about the opposite side of angry.
Yeah, so what Baldy was saying, for those who may not be able to hear, not just talking about angry players, but also about more intense situations where someone's having a crisis of some kind, for example. That's what I'll call that crisis behavior. I saw someone in the back. Yeah.
As a teacher, I use de-escalation a lot, and I try to use it more strategies to use it better and more effectively.
Yeah, so you want to learn more so you can apply it to your non-judging life. Okay, I think that's great.
Use it in judging. I use it in our role.
Okay,
I want to do it more in judging.
Yeah, perfect, exactly. So I think that actually is a great segue into the justification for this conference, for this talk, which is that the ability to resolve conflict is essential, not just as judges, but also as people. Throughout our daily lives, maybe not daily lives, but throughout our regular lives, we are going to come into tense situations where we have to have really important conversations with people, and there's going to be something on the line. So this could be in a relationship with your significant other, with your parents, with your manager at work, where you want something or they want something from you, and you're not willing to give that. Maybe there's a disagreement about your communication style. There's some disagreement about the way you're spending or allocating your time. So being able to resolve these conflicts is very important. But I am going to, so while I hope this will be universal, there's also some very important reasons to talk about conflict resolution as a judge. So Matteo mentioned that there were the 9 level 3 qualities. And so as people who might be going towards level 3, becoming regional judges, you'll be expected to talk about all these qualities. Are there any qualities that seem especially relevant for this topic? Conflict, resolution, and de-escalation. Teamwork, diplomacy, maturity is one, absolutely, sure. Yeah. So stress and conflict management. So I think teamwork, diplomacy, maturity is a very big one, especially on the diplomacy aspect. That'll be kind of baked in. But I did want to specifically call out the definition of stress and conflict management. Level 3 judges can perform under pressure, maintaining a calm and focused demeanor at all times. They can handle leadership duties without allowing stress or pressure to adversely affect their performance. They are capable of managing conflict as it arises between players, judges, event staff, etc., and they can do so without displaying signs of stress, doubt, or panic. Very important, definitely conflict resolution and de-escalation. It goes on to talk about how a deficient judge is someone who cannot handle these responsibilities without it adversely affecting the performance, whereas an exemplary judge is someone who can do so in a very effective manner, might even become a better judge under pressure and really rises to the occasion. Maybe using a show of hands, on a scale of 1 to I need a lot more work in this quality, to a scale of 5. I think I'm one of the experts in this quality. How do people feel about stress and conflict management for themselves right now? So a bunch of people in the middle with like 3s and 4s, people who really want to work on that. That's great. I'm hoping that you will all learn something from this topic. And also, like I said, at various points, feel free to jump in. Because of the format of the room, there aren't going to be a small discussion as part of this talk, but I do appreciate questions from the audience and interactions from there. But I think there's so we've talked about level 3 qualities and why they're important, but I think there might be some other qualities that also clue us in to why conflict resolution and de-escalation are important. Does anyone have an idea of what those other qualities might be? They're relatively new, published within the past 6 months or so. There are CFB's qualities of core judges. So there's actually a number of core qualities which I think are very important to be aware of. I reference them myself in my cover letters for being a core judge. And there are 2 in particular that I think really emphasize that CFB cares about this quality as well. So the first is soft skills, and particularly down at the bottom. So judges with excellent soft skills, according to CFB, are effective at diffusing tense situations, handling people who are distressed or upset. And if you have been to staff parties, you will definitely hear about judges who are given a recognition from the CFB red shirts and from the burgundies because they handled some specific player or some specific situation very well, very adeptly. So soft skills, super important to CFB, super important to core judging. Additionally, we have performance under pressure. I think this is very similar to stress and conflict management with a different name. As it says, CFB counts on their leads to work with stage management and head judges to keep them apprised of situations, work on solutions, and keep players calm. Very important to be able to do this if you would like to be a core judge or to be a regional judge, to be a leader in our community, especially when it comes to events. So I was kind of trying to justify why this conversation is important, besides the fact that it's on the agenda for the leadership conference. So with that, I'd like to talk about when can conflict arise. Specifically at a Magic tournament. What are some like general categories of conflict you might see or you might end up getting involved in?
However,
appeals. Appeals. I actually really like this. Appeals are in fact a type of conflict. We'll touch on that I think a little bit more later on.
When you've got an investigation involving a player accusing their opponent of cheating, and so the person either accusing the opponent of cheating gets really frustrated, or the reverse, the person who's being accused is like, I'm not a cheater.
Yes, so investigations of cheating or wrongdoing are bringing the two players very directly in conflict.
Life disparities.
Life disparities, exactly. So we'll get into that as well. Just the players don't agree on reality, as was said earlier. Yeah. Cool. So, like Manny, I haven't totally mastered the trick of making these appear in the exact order, but as a couple of general examples, players might disagree with a judge's ruling that might escalate even further into an appeal, but players and judges can come into conflict because of the rules, because of policy. Players themselves can kind of come in conflict with the rules by making a mistake, committing a penalty, and a judge needs to intervene in order to solve the conflict and to put a resolution to it. Judges are human and make mistakes. This is also a kind of conflict, one that can have very adverse effects not only on the players but also on judges themselves. And then finally, we have a player is abusive or aggressive. So this is going to bleed a lot into the de-escalation element. But players themselves can be acting in an unsporting manner or inappropriately. And again, as judges, as arbiters of the rules, that's when we can step in and protect the other players from that person's behavior. Yeah, in the back.
So that goes into the general.
I think having a large community is
right?
to like social awareness needs like
at the end of
oblivious problems. So like spectators, you know, committing OA just because they don't
sometimes we
feel
bad.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, what was is that? Was there anything else you wanted to say? Yeah. So spectators are all kind of in the player category for this. Spectators can commit the same kinds of problems that players can, and you might treat them slightly differently based on their role in the context, but spectators are very much under this purview as well.
That is making sure everyone's having fun, making sure everyone feels safe.
Finally, there's actually just a huge element of miscommunication that can cause conflict. This is where the players might actually be on the same, trying to cooperate, but they aren't understanding each other, they aren't understanding the judge, and that is causing some kind of conflict between everyone as well. So, what all of these have in common is that conflict arises when reality doesn't match expectation. This is actually very similar to Manny's talk where he talked about players want to feel addressed in their rulings. So if players feel as though their beliefs are being violated, their expectations aren't being matched, that's when conflicts can come out. So I think that's going to be a theme that I'd like people to keep in mind when we're going through this presentation. And as a judge, it's our job to sort of step in and help the player come back to a more comfortable place and guide them along that journey specifically.
It's fun.
How do we do that? There's actually a lot of different ways. So this is going to be the next big section of the presentation where I talk about strategies for de-escalation. I looked into a couple of different sources, as I mentioned, and all of them actually said the same kinds of things. That there are 5 main ways of resolving conflicts. And you can actually think of these as occurring along 2 different axes. The first axis at the bottom is cooperativeness. Are the players and are the people involved uncooperative or very cooperative? And the second axis is assertiveness. Are you, as the mediator, being non-assertive or highly assertive? And so you combine these, and you end up with 5 different strategies. One for each quadrant of the 2 axes, and then one that's kind of in the middle, compromising. And I'm going to step through each of these in turn, and I'm going to give an example of where this strategy might be applied, and we'll discuss whether that's a successful strategy or an unsuccessful strategy. In case anyone can't see, so in the lower left, we have avoiding, which is the uncooperative, unassertive strategy. In the lower right, we have accommodating, which is the cooperative but unassertive strategy. In the top left, we have competing, which is the assertive but not cooperative strategy. In the top right, we have collaborative, which is both cooperative and assertive. And then kind of in the middle, we have compromising, which is where compromise belongs. So with that, I'm going to start with the avoidance strategy. Here's an example of an avoidant way of handling conflict. You're at a Grand Prix, you hear Andy and Nate arguing about a combat trick. Andy thinks it works a particular way, is trying to convince Nate of their opinion, and Nate thinks it's supposed to work some other way. Nate seems confused and looks at you, and you break eye contact and keeps walking down the row and like pushing some chips. This is an avoidance strategy of handling a conflict. This is sometimes called a lose-lose type of strategy, because Nate isn't getting what he wants, Andy is going to get their way, and that might not even be what's correct. You are effectively abdicating your responsibility as a tournament official and not helping a player, Nate, who is actually in a conflict with his opponent. This is sort of obviously bad, but can anyone think of a situation where an avoidance strategy might actually be successful? So I see the first name in the back.
So the IPG,
a player was upset with a particular ruling you gave and whatnot. They just don't like you.
Sure. Okay, so you're trying to avoid a specific player, and
So they throw the next call, and instead of you going to find someone else, hey, can you take this call?
kind of vague.
sure. Okay, that makes sense to me. I like it.
If someone doesn't feel safe,
A player not actually engaged in a
that's
match,
in
but
the USC. If someone
ranting to their
doesn't
friends
feel
about the match
okay
previously, like they're
or
talking
enjoying
to
it,
not
that
read
might be a USC.
Yeah, so I think that some of the things you're talking about are bleeding a little bit into accommodating, so we'll discuss them on the next slide.
ICG
But
also offers
again, it's this kind of a spectrum of strategies, and we're identifying 5 different regions of behavior.
Oh, it's funny that you were going
Oh,
to
no.
the next slide.
Ah, that was a mistake.
I was also going to say, I got distracted by the slides.
Sorry.
It's okay. So if you take those steps on and they actually eventually resolve it amongst themselves.
Right, so the option that was offered was that you ignore these players, and they do eventually come to the correct solution themselves. In the front.
Telling the players that you'll be able to address this conflict later. So if the player really wants to go into it saying, hey, I can't discuss this with you right now,
Yeah.
But we can speak after the round or after the match.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's all the time we have that, but that's one of the main ways where accommodation avoidance can actually be successful, where you have too much going on and you need to prioritize other things, and maybe you'll get to some of the things at the bottom, but they just can't be your priority right now. So this is a strategy that's an option to you. It is often the wrong thing to be doing, and if you catch yourself using it, that could be a good motivator that you need to involve somebody else in the situation to go into that situation for you and take care of it, and hopefully at a time when you have more space and room to think, try and figure out why you're avoiding the situation, and is there anything you can do to fix that moving forward. So this is the lower left quadrant, the lose-lose quadrant. The next quadrant is accommodation. So this is sometimes called the lose-win strategy, where you are being very cooperative but not assertive at all. So the example is that you give Andy a match loss for marked cards because their deck has some Hunt Masters of Fells in it that you can clearly see through their sleeves. Andy is very upset and tries to convince you that actually their deck is not marked, and you let them spend 10 minutes talking to you doing this, delaying the entire tournament because they still have 1 or 2 more games left to play. You give them a game loss for marked cards. This is, again, kind of a bad situation, because by interacting with this player, you have delayed the entire rest of the tournament. You haven't really lived up to your expectation as a tournament official who is being an impartial arbiter of the rules. You gave the correct ruling. Andy is just trying to get their way instead, and you aren't being firm enough in pushing back on that. Now, that's the bad example, but again, I think all of these strategies have a good and a bad perspective. Are there some situations where accommodation might actually be the correct thing to do? Yeah.
Sometimes the player's in the right, the conflict's coming in there on the
How many of y'all have seen a player?
I partially heard that. You were saying that sometimes the player is actually correct. Yeah, so sometimes it's judges will make mistakes, and this actually comes up, I think, a fair amount on appeals. And this will lead a little bit into a later thing. Again, spectrum, kind of a little fuzzy. But sometimes the player is correct, and you want to give them that space.
It's just a warning, right? A warning is a minor infraction that really doesn't mean anything unless you get more warning. There's definitely a lot of space.
A lot of it is just listening to the players so they feel like
incessantly.
So the quintessential example of where accommodation is a very effective strategy is when the immediate conflict has actually been resolved. The player just wants to vent. They want to feel heard and addressed. And even though you aren't going to or aren't able to change the situation, you can listen, you can help explain, you can help them try and find some kind of resolution, but the decision is locked in stone. That's where an accommodating strategy can actually be very effective. Questions from Jeff?
There are also situations where the player isn't necessarily correct, but their point of view is reasonable. And you want to be able to accommodate that with if you. I'm sorry, I'm creating things out of it.
That's fine. Yeah. So.
Go ahead. I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. So hold that thought. The thought was that sometimes the player is reasonable or has a good point, and you want to tell them that that is being heard and being acted on. So hold that particular thought. Cool. So our third strategy is referred to by a lot of different names. Sometimes referred to as competition, but I prefer to think of it as actually confrontation. So confrontation is often a very scary word, but it doesn't have to be. As judges, sometimes our job is to confront players and situations and resolve them. And this is where that strategy can really come into play. So this is actually an example that happened to me. Time is calling around. Andy starts arguing with Nate about his piece of play from earlier in the match and starts trying to demand that Andy concede. You are the end of round judge. You intervene and you insert yourself into the conversation and let Andy know that their behavior is not appropriate. This is very assertive. And it's not prompted. You have a point of view, and you're expressing it. You are imposing it onto the players in this match, specifically Andy, who is being rude and aggressive here. And I apologize if I messed up the names at some point. This is very important, a very important skill to have as judges, because we are the ones who are arbitrating what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And players are sometimes going to cross that line to not just their own detriment, but to the detriment of people around them. And I think I'll mention this a couple of times, but violations of conduct are not private. There's always at least one other person around, their opponent, and there's probably going to be other people who might be listening, who might hear about it later, who might see this interaction from afar, whether literally in the hall or from the social media. So it's very important to always be willing to insert yourself into situations where you're needed. And in particular, sometimes you will need to take the non-cooperative, assertive way of just saying, this was not appropriate, we need to fix this. And later in the presentation, I'll talk about some more strategies for having that conversation effectively. But as a strategy, confrontation is very important. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the confrontation strategy?
Someone being hurt by someone else's actions is
So our fourth strategy is compromise. So this is sometimes referred to as win some, lose some. We all kind of know what compromise is from history class and everything. But just to give an example, suppose that Felix, the floor judge, comes in and gives Andy a warning for game violation. Andy appeals to you, the head judge. You uphold the ruling, but you discover, perhaps using techniques from Andy's presentation, the reason that Andy was appealing was because they thought that Nate should also receive a penalty. And you, as the head judge, agree. Nate should have gotten a penalty for failure to maintain the game state. This is a compromising type situation that you might encounter as a floor judge / head judge. And it's one I use a lot when I'm taking appeals. It's like, the penalty is correct, but. And but is, I think, a pretty good indicator that we're in a compromising situation type of way. Can anyone think of other situations in Magic tournaments where compromise might come up?
We might want to address that, right?
So there was, this is more of the global tournament. There were matches going on at the end of a round, and we were at like -20, so they compromised and started everybody else. and left those players there, let them finish and got the time extensions on their next match.
Sure. So for folks who couldn't hear that,
Jumping at least one step into game loss territory, right?
at one point during the Mythic Championship or other tournaments, there was one match that was outgoing, had a very long extension. The decision was made to have that match keep going, prepare everybody else, have them start their match. That is kind of a compromising, problem-solving type situation. And that's, I think, a good bridge into the point, which is that compromise involves a lot of creative problem solving. So I think you'll mostly see this not so much with players sometimes, but more in the domain of working with other teams at events. There can be conflict between judges at events. I'm not going to talk about that so much, but it's good to be aware of. And if folks have questions about conflicts between judges or judges and staff, by all means ask them. So being able to compromise among team leaders or with head judges or with TOs is very important. And additionally, if you're ever in a tournament staff role, where you're working for CFBE, for example, or some other TO, and an upset player comes to you, maybe they're being brought over by the head judge, maybe as the TO you have some kind of compromise you can help alleviate them with. The player is still losing because they're getting a match loss or whatever other penalty, but you're giving them some free draft entry or something along those lines. So, I saw a hand in the back that then, yeah.
Cool. That was actually something I was waiting to ask about. Because especially as leaders,
The wording is reasonably expected. So there is the same argument of USC minor that the intent is not, the intent to not harm anyone is not necessary.
And I was wondering if you could talk more about what this will look like.
If an action taken by a player could reasonably be expected to offend someone or make someone
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I can certainly put this in a slide, but I think there are two main modes of power dynamic, as Megan alluded to. There's asymmetric relationships, where one person has a lot more explicit authority than the other, and that's the mode as judges that we're going to largely be engaging with players in. We are the judge, we're wearing the black shirt, they know we're a judge, they know we have power, quote unquote, over them. So we have this asymmetric relationship. But then there's symmetric ones, or closer to symmetric, where you have community leaders interacting with each other, you have floor judges interacting with each other, judges and team leads interacting with each other, or even the interaction among TOs can kind of skew between sometimes asymmetric and sometimes very symmetric. So when it comes to symmetric situations, compromise is a very important strategy to have in your arsenal, because you need to come to a resolution together. All of those modes on the left side, where you just have the, on the bottom of the chart, where you have the low assertiveness. So when you're in a symmetric relationship, the top mode where you have these assertive ones are not available to you. You need to try and find something that's much more in the middle, which is where compromise really excels. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay, hopefully we can circle back to it. Again, I mostly, because of the type of the talk, conflict resolution and de-escalation, I decided to focus on the asymmetric relationships instead, but I'm happy to talk more about it later, especially because that hinges on leadership, diplomacy, and teamwork.
For that example.
So our fifth one, collaboration, is sometimes called the win-win strategy, where you actually manage to make all parties happy. This is the highly cooperative but also highly assertive mode, where you are directly engaged and all parties are kind of working with you. So an example from a tournament is that Andy is having trouble explaining rules in action to their opponent Nate. So this is different from the first one, where instead of Nate being confused and just sort of throwing up his shields, Nate is inquisitive and tries to want to know more. And you can notice this and intervene, and both players are actually happy to work with you to understand what's really happening. So this is a collaborative mode of conflict resolution. And one of the main purposes of this section is to really try and pitch collaboration and compromise as the main modes to engage upon, where you're working with the player to reach some happier point. And that's where you also get to pull in the pieces from the next section, which is the de-escalation techniques. Are there any questions about this slide or this section before I move on?
Can you give me a few examples of compromising?
Of compromising? So go for it.
So a player is late to register for the tournament, and in a Grand Prix they're meant to get a match loss or something like that. But the reason why they're late is because the previous tournament was delayed or something like that. So as a compromise, they get some extra ticks from the TO.
Right. So like I mentioned earlier, this is often where you might, as judges, the IPG does not have a lot of room actually for compromise. Things are relatively black and white. And if you believe that a player has committed an infraction, they should receive that penalty. It's very dangerous to try and compromise in that situation. However, in an event setting overall, there might be compromises available, whether because we involve a TO or because we're able to find some kind of downgrade clause that exists for tardiness, for example, or along those lines. I see a hand there.
Even in situations where you can't change the outcome that the player is experiencing, you might be able to compromise by giving them another avenue to be heard. So presenting them the feedback form or saying, I'm sorry, we need to hold to this ruling, so that's the confrontational part of it, but if you want to continue to discuss this, you can discuss this with the head judge or with the TO or provide feedback here. Right, giving them some other avenue to explore recourse could be a conciliatory gesture.
Yeah, so another great conciliatory gesture is the feedback form, for example. Whether you offer them the link to the Magic Judge feedback form or direct them to the TO so they can kind of vent to the TO and express their displeasure. Okay. Right. So we have a conflict. We've resolved it maybe, but how do we de-escalate it? So when I talk about de-escalation, what I mean is a player is having a bad time, and you are there to try and fix that and try and bring them back to a more normal state. And the quote here is that peace is not a noun, it's a verb. So as judges, we actually have a bit of an opportunity to be peacemakers either in the community as a whole, or more specifically, in a specific moment with a particular player and a particular interaction. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about what it means to de-escalate a conflict and how we can actually go about doing that. And the main thing that I found when I was reflecting on my own experiences and when I was reading through some of the literature is that a key to being a peacemaker is to be appropriately assertive. And what do I mean by that? I mean these bullet points. So the first one is to be organized in thought, communication, and action. And I think this is very important as judges. Because there's so much going on, and sometimes it can be very complex as to what the correct resolution of a situation may be. I'll talk about this during the final section with a couple of different penalties, but having mastery of the various unsporting conduct infractions and when they apply and why they apply is really what I'm saying here when I talk about being organized in thought. When it comes to communication, you need to know what you want to say and how you're going to say it. Players are going to respond very instinctively to the way you communicate with them. And we want to make sure that we're doing that in an appropriate way, in a way that kind of engenders them to us and makes them understand that we are an expert, but also builds rapport and empathy. And then finally, you need to be organized in action. This kind of means that when you have a situation on your hands, you need to figure out your battle plan ahead of time. There might be some flexibility with when new information arises, but when you're having this crucial conversation with the player, hopefully you already know some of the paths that it will take, and you're committed to one of those plans ahead of time. This is also something that we build from experience. Once you've given unsporting conduct minor once or twice, it becomes far easier all the rest of the times because you have a script, you kind of know what's going to be happening. So that's the first one. The second one is highly interrelated, this meaningful interpersonal relationship. This is, I think, mostly done through communication, but also through non-verbal communication. So the way that you are comporting yourself and the way that you're interacting with them. On the next slide, I'm going to give a lot of negative examples of ways to not act in your behavior, which might be a little easier to describe than the good ways to act. But in general, you want to be friendly yet firm when you're talking to the player and trying to help them de-escalate appropriately. And then finally, kind of a summary of all of the above, I think I've mentioned these exact words before, being competent and being confident. If you are clear in what you're trying to be doing, the player is much more likely to accept your resolution, whatever it ends up being, as opposed to trying to escalate even further up to a head judge or TO or what have you. So being appropriately assertive is incredibly important for de-escalating conflicts, establishing that you're the one who is kind of guiding the player into a better place. The flip side is that there are some very bad ways to act. So we don't want to be aggressive to the player. We don't want to be demeaning or condescending to them. We should never say things that make them feel super defensive or make them think that we don't really understand what's going on in their own head. We want to be empathetic. And I think these are things that we try to avoid all the time as judges. And hopefully I'm just sort of giving some conscious voice into things that you're all already doing. Are there any questions or thoughts about this? I saw a hand shoot up.
Yeah.
Specifically, player acting,
You have to get.
we need physical safety at events. Violently Italian, we can't go keep playing Magic.
You're in a position where you have to, put your foot down and say, hey, this is not okay. This is what we need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. So if you look through the level 3 qualities, there's a line under investigations that is very important and relevant to this topic, which is that a level 3 judge can issue disqualifications firmly and unapologetically and without remorse. And this is, I think, the same thing that applies when giving other sorts of unsporting conduct penalties. The player did do something wrong and needs to be made aware of this, but you also want to help educate them and not just sort of throw the proverbial book at them and make them feel bad. Additionally, Michael alluded to this at the beginning, there are situations when a player is going to not be escalated because they've acted inappropriately, but escalated because they are in crisis. This is a very big topic that I am not fully qualified to talk about, but many of the same adjectives and responses do apply to those crisis situations as well. So when I say crisis situation, I'm talking about a player is in tears because they have been bullied or harassed. They've been the victim of one of the unsporting conduct penalties. Maybe they're having a really bad day for a non-magic related reason. Maybe they're part of this community and you're trying to console them because they're a friend or because you're part of their area or their region. Those crisis situations, the objective isn't to try and make them realize that they are wrong, educate them. The objective is to sort of bring them back down to a normal state so that things can continue. And the same strategy of effective communication and trying to guide them to a better place applies in crisis situations as well. With those tools established, I wanted to try something where we examine a real conflict and a real resolution that actually happened here in Las Vegas at the World Series of Poker. To give a small amount of background, you don't have to be a poker player to understand this. A tournament official, a dealer, a floor judge effectively, made a mistake that caused another player who was basically kind of waiting in contention to make a play that he didn't intend to make. And that player is sort of trying to escalate this up the chain to the effective head judge of the tournament, a guy named Jack. So he's the guy that we're going to be examining here in the suit, and right here. And the player in red is the upset.
He asked for a count. I miscounted and said 17.2. He moved this stack of chips forward.
And
he said,
no, it's not
wrong
17.
count. It's 22.
Okay. It's 22 something.
Doesn't matter. It's accepted action with the chips, regardless of what the dealer says. The action is going to stand, and you're going to have to call the bet. That's an accepted action. The hands are out. The chips are in play. The action is going to stand as it is. It's an accepted action. It's very clear in the rules. There's no change in this decision. This is a very simple decision. So we're going to make the bet right. for what the bet needs to be.
Sorry. Okay.
She could say it was. She could say it was 3 million. She could say it was 3 million. She could say it was 3 million. There'd be 30 million out there. You would still be held to the same.
No, wait. But
chips.
17 and 22
doesn't matter.
Eh?
Doesn't matter. It's accepted action.
And 27.
Listen to me. We have a rule in the World Series of Poker. It's called accepted action. You're accepting the action that's in front of you, regardless of what the amount is, regardless of what she said. Even though she miscounted, what you see, it's still your responsibility to understand. Doesn't matter. You can't talk your way out of it. The call is going to be for the amount, which is going to be 22 million?
22.2.
22.2. That's going to be the call.
It's not fair for sure. This is not fair.
That's it. That's it.
This is not fair for sure.
Let's roll. You're calling 17, you're calling 22.
That's not true.
With that out there, what are some thoughts about what Jack, the guy in the suit, did well in this judge call? Next.
He explained that this rule of accepted actions exists regardless of what the stakes are in any situation. So,
Sure.
Making clear that it's a general solution, not necessarily a specific solution.
Hey nerds!
Exactly, I agree. So he tried to justify the ruling and explain what was going on.
He also pointed out what the player was supposed to be responsible for.
Yeah.
So you do need to explain to the player you are responsible for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
You are also responsible for making sure that the game state is correct in some form or fashion.
Exactly. What are some things that Jack did not so well? Alright, lots of cases. Someone I haven't heard from yet. In the back? Well, not
The
much. Go
default
ahead.
judge and the default player are usually he, him, his pronouns. Maybe we can change it up, or usually the pronouns. And don't make excuses, apologize, don't do it again.
Yeah.
Making excuses draws out the situation and just makes it a lot less pleasant for everyone.
Yeah, so we have some very interesting choices with physical positioning, which I'll talk about more. Jeff?
Use character pronouns.
The floor kind of
unfamiliar with someone's pronouns.
tried to de-escalate the situation from a position of authority rather than cooperating with the player to explain to him what's going on.
I think that's a great summary. The Jack was kind of acting from a position of I'm an authority, you have to listen to me, as opposed to this is why you should listen to me. Anyone else?
I was going to say it wasn't very fair. He didn't give the poker player the chance to have their say and explain it and be like, you're just saying words, you can't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is slightly edited, but I would agree that the player didn't get a lot of chance to speak until after Jack had already made sort of the final ruling.
It's likely that they're going to continue playing, and there's going to be ongoing hostility between the player and the dealer for the remainder of this event.
That's an interesting observation. So someone said that there might be ongoing hostility between the player and the dealer, which might have to be considered as well. So I think the main thing is that Jack was actually very aggressive and demeaning towards the other player, saying you can't talk your way out of this one. There's something that got cut off in the clip that where Jack actually says, if you're calling, it doesn't matter what I rule. If you're calling 17, you're also calling 22, which elicits a very immediate, I can't believe this person just said that reaction from everyone at the table. It's kind of like as a judge saying that we don't really understand why you'd be playing a certain card in your deck. And that's an underpinning of our ruling. It was completely extraneous information that Jack just brought into the conversation for no real good reason. I'll send out the link about this and some thoughts so you can examine it in a more quiet setting. With that, I do want to get through the last couple of slides where we talk about applying penalties. So kind of summarizing all of these things. To Megan's point, I also thought it was very interesting, aka probably wrong, that this all happened on camera with microphones in public view. At no point did Jack bring the player aside privately, talk to the dealer privately, talk to any of the other players involved privately. It was all super public. I don't know why. Sometimes that's going to be unavoidable, where we have a call on camera and we have to get involved. But if at all possible, try and bring the players to a different place, separate them from the source of their anxiety, whether that's another player or the game itself, and that'll help them get out of their elevated state. There's also a lot of repetitive words being used in that conversation, with the player repeating themselves multiple times, and so did Jack. Jack did an okay job of trying to add some new information later on, but overall was very repetitive. As much as possible, you want to offer alternatives, and this interrelates with the next option, which is something called the rule of two. If a player sort of brushes you off twice, that is a good sign that you should consider involving a higher authority, whether that's the head judge by saying, okay, it sounds like you would like to talk to the head judge and appeal, or I can go get the TO, something along those lines. That's a really good cutoff point for involving somebody else.
Error was stolen from Steve Argyle.
So those are a couple of tips for handling de-escalation. Really fast, I want to talk about issuing penalties. I think there are 3 main penalties that will come up at these events. Unsporting conduct minor. Player takes action that is disruptive to the tournament or the participants. Receives a warning. And you have major, which is a match loss. Player takes action towards one or more people that could create a feeling of being harassed, threatened, bullied, or stalked. That also includes insults based on protected classes. And then finally, we have aggressive behavior, which is a disqualification for acting in a threatening way. These are all very serious. I'm curious, as a show of hands, if you've issued a aggressive behavior.
I do hear some murmurings of that is actual.
What if you've issued unsporting conduct major? Unsporting conduct minor? Much more. That's great. I was actually very worried that very few hands would go up for unsporting conduct minor. I think that sometimes we don't issue risky minor when we should, because as judges, we are afraid of escalating the situation further. So that's the main thing I want to talk about as the last slide. How do we effectively close a situation when issuing a penalty? In my experience, it's rarely correct to start by issuing the penalty. Instead, we want to use our skills of being appropriately assertive at the beginning to build rapport, to get a player into a slightly better place where they understand that they have done something wrong, and then say, because your actions were inappropriate, I'm going to be issuing you unsporting conduct minor as a warning. This is just a way of saying that what you did was not appropriate and that the behavior needs to be corrected for the future. Something along those lines. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this may be a negative experience for one player, especially in that moment, but it is going to be a positive experience for everybody else in the tournament, who hopefully is going to feel safer and more comfortable with that kind of appropriate penalty having been issued. It's always very gratifying when the player comes up and thanks you for issuing a penalty. Sometimes it actually will be the player that you give unsporting conduct to, but it might just as well be somebody else who's watching and says, thank you for issuing that penalty. I bring my little brother to these things. I feel much better bringing him now. This is actually been resolved. So again, this is a very big topic. I think I could spend much more time going through a lot more examples. But I do want to basically say thank you so much for coming. I've tried to explain why this is important, not just as people, but also as future level 2 judges, as support judges for CFPA, as firm and correct arbiters of tournament policy. I explained 5 strategies for resolving conflict, ranging from being completely accommodating to being collaborative and compromising. Talked about de-escalation techniques, being appropriately assertive, separating the players from their anxiety, breaking out of loops, involving higher authority. And finally, we touched on how to actually issue penalties. I'm more than happy to take questions afterwards, but I think